Hey there, and welcome to Just the News. We've got a great author for you today. His name is Tevi Troy. Tevi is a best-selling author and presidential historian. He served as deputy assistant to the president under President George W. Bush. He later became acting assistant for domestic policy to the president. Tevi is the author of Shall We Wake the President? It's a history of presidents dealing with disasters. He also wrote the book What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House. Tevi's here today to talk about his latest book. It is titled Fight House, Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump. Tevi, welcome to Just the News.
Thank you. Always happy to come and talk about Fight House.
So, Tevi, walk us through today. Your book is looking at from Truman to Trump. Right now, there is a lot of tumult happening with the campaign. There's a lot of media coverage. Trump obviously has a tumultuous relationship with the media, but there's a lot of media coverage saying that the Trump White House is unstable, that the Trump White House has enormous turnover. How does the Trump White House compare to predecessors here in the modern era?
It's a great question. And in fact, I wrote Fight House in order to address this very question. I was listening to a talk by Peter Robinson, who is a Reagan White House speechwriter. And I remember he said something that really struck me. He said, of course, there was fighting in the Reagan White House. We just didn't have Twitter, tweeter, twatter talking about it. And the fact is that there's always been fighting in the White House, especially in the period that I cover. I start with Truman because Truman was the first president to begin with a White House staff. He had a White House staff for his meeting. And what I found in Fight House is that the White House staff has always been at war with each other and also with the cabinet agencies. It's kind of endemic to the structure that we have with the White House. Now, some White Houses have a little more fighting, some have a little less, but there's always been fighting. And my book, Fight House, has great and delicious details of fights that have taken place in every single administration in the period I covered.
And it's an interesting point because in the book you look at sort of this cult of personality, and you looked, for example, at Dwight Eisenhower. He was coming from the military. He really didn't like it when his staff were kind of being divas or devos and getting their own followings. And as you said, Twitter, the age of social media, a lot of these staffers have their own sort of media empires, or in the case of John Bolton, now he's making a book. Why do you think that change happened in terms of people who are serving at the White House seeing themselves as more anonymous to, on the other side of things, an Omarosa, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question, Carrie. And in fact, the Brownlow Commission, which was the commission that recommended that the president needs help and that recommended the creation of the White House staff, specifically said that the president should have a series of aides with a, quote, passion for anonymity. And now, obviously, as you correctly note, Carrie, that passion seems to have gone out the window. I actually identify it as coming in the Kennedy administration. Kennedy brought in celebrity aides for the first time. People like Arthur Schlesinger, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, served in the White House, and there was a lot of attention about the fact that a well-known guy like Arthur Schlesinger was serving in the White House, and he wasn't the only one. And this whole notion of bringing in the celebrity aides, somebody who brings their fame with them, led to people with A, greater egos, B, more notoriety, C, more relationships with the press. And once you have people like that, it not only leads to more fighting, but it leads to more attention to their ongoings. And then you have some of the things that we talked about in subsequent years, in that fighting is something that the press covers because they know that it's happening and therefore they can cover it.
Well, an interesting nugget that you mentioned in the book was when, after JFK was assassinated, that LBJ, his predecessor, said to Schlesinger reportedly that if you quit, I will prosecute you, or just you can't quit, presumably because he was worried about sort of the PR toll it would take to have a celebrity like Arthur Schlesinger leaving. Very interesting nuggets that you unearthed for the readers. But talk to us about...
One great point on that is it's true that he did tell Schlesinger that he was going to prosecute if he left, but he didn't give Schlesinger anything to do in the White House because he didn't trust him. So what LBJ did was he kind of forced the Kennedy staff to stay on, but he hired his own parallel staff, and they were the ones doing the work, while the Kennedy folks were kind of figureheads just sitting there at a little board, and that also led to some resentment.
So do you think, again, going back to today, based on what you've learned in your research for this book, do you think that the media is inaccurate and overblowing how tumultuous or how much rivalry there is in the Trump White House compared to other presidencies?
Yeah, I think you used two interesting words there. One is inaccurate and B, overblowing. So inaccurate is kind of a factual matter. And, I'm not seeing evidence that it's not true that there's fighting in the White House. There's obviously fighting in the White House. The question is overblowing it. And when you say overblowing it, then you have to compare it to what? And what I found in Fight House is that there's been fighting in every single administration dating back to the Truman administration. The grade for this current administration is obviously incomplete because we don't know the full story yet. I haven't yet had access to the archives. Those things open up later. Also, some of the post-administration memoirs are often very interesting. So, for example, with the Obama administration, I learned all kinds of stuff about fightings that were taking place during the Obama administration that we, the American people, didn't know about during the administration because the Obama administration was very invested in this notion of no drama Obama. And they made it sound like there was no fighting, but we've certainly learned subsequent to the Obama administration that there were plenty of fights. And it's really only with the fullness of time can a historian figure out what actually happened.
And looking at the 2020 race, it is very close in terms of polling being, if we're looking at 2016 as a guide, it is very close. Is there anything, and again, you mentioned that the archives are still, some of them are not available for the Obama administration, but is there anything that you've came in your research of the Obama administration that might be embarrassing or uncomfortable or something that the press is not looking at enough about Biden or just about the Obama administration overall?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really come up with anything great on Biden and infighting between Biden and Obama or anything like that. But I did find that there was a gender divide in the Obama White House and that the senior staff women kind of bound together. And in doing so, they often did so at the expense of men. And they had certain interests that they were pursuing. And there are cases that I talk about in the book of men who thought they were going to get jobs and actually were in line to get certain jobs and they didn't get them. And a woman got the job instead. The women of the White House, they actually had a kind of name for themselves. They called themselves the Vagiants, excuse the term, but they were the big shot women in the White House, and they had dinners of just women to the exclusion of men. So there was definitely a sense that there were some kind of interesting gender tensions going on in that White House.
And Biden has certainly come under fire by women for saying that Biden made them feel inappropriate, that there was touching. What did you see? Did you see anything in terms of this gender dynamic between Biden and the women in this group, or even just women in general?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I did the research for this book and finished it before the advent of the Me Too movement. So I didn't really see much on Biden in that. I think it would have been something I had explored if some of the stories about Biden and women had come out earlier. But I really didn't see much about Biden being in the thick of the fighting while he was in the White House.
Mm-hmm. So what was his relationship then between this group of women and Biden?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think it was that this group of women, they were, I guess, intimidating to some of the men. Maybe the men didn't want to cross them. And it sounds like Biden was in that same category. You don't want to end up on the wrong side of a story about you being opposed to the advancement of women in the Obama White House. So I think that might have been part of the dynamic.
That's interesting. Would you say that the men felt like they were being bullied or unfairly targeted because of their gender?
Well, I don't want to go too far out because you don't have beyond what my research showed. But there was one guy, Dan Pfeiffer, who specifically thought he was supposed to be the communications manager or communications director in the Obama White House, and he was passed over by a woman named Ellen Moran, who wasn't even on the campaign, and she had backed Hillary. And Pfeiffer was a little angry at that taking place. And he writes in his memoir of all the rules that took place in the Obama White House to kind of minimize infighting, and he brags about all these rules, and then when he is passed over in this way by this woman, he kind of throws out the rules out the window and does all these things that he says we weren't supposed to do in Obama land to object to the way he was treated.
And in terms of the again, this question of technology really being a tool to amplify what was already existing before Twitter and before the advent of the ability to send something immediately with just the tap of your cell phone. You said it was JFK and his administration that really took away this quote unquote passion for anonymity. Do you think that had to do with mass media and the advent of television to some degree, and or was it more sort of the notion of Camelot and the mythology that JFK was looking to cultivate?
I would have to say both on that. The Camelot mythology, which, by the way, JFK himself never heard of. It was something that Jackie talked about in an interview to Theodore White after Kennedy was tragically assassinated. But there was definitely a sense that the Kennedy administration used television to its advantage. And in fact, there's a great story that Kennedy, after the 1960 election in which he won the presidency, he's walking with one of his aides and they see a TV and he points at it and says, we wouldn't have had a prayer without that gadget. Imagine in 1960, they're calling television that gadget. But Kennedy was very conscious of the fact that television was a huge aid to him. And I think one of the points that I have in Fight House, not just in Fight House, but in my earlier book about what Jefferson read, I watched, Obama tweeted, is that as technologies evolve, there are more and more messages out there, but there's also more ways for aides to get their messages out there, whether it's leaking to them or post-administration when they have roles on talk radio or on TV shows or on Twitter.
And how does John Bolton's book and the revelations he's making, how does that compare in terms of the fierce battle that's happening about disclosures that are allegedly classified or that the Trump administration is saying are inappropriate and should not be released, and it's even going to the judiciary? How does someone like Bolton compare with predecessors in terms of staff going and releasing information, whether it's a book or a news article?
Yeah, so in the Obama administration, you had Bob Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense, published his memoir that talked about his experience within the Obama administration. More famously, perhaps, was George Stephanopoulos in the Clinton administration, wrote his memoir, All Too Human, which is one of the best White House memoirs ever, but it had a lot of revelations about Clinton that staff didn't want to have take place and to emerge during the administration. And in fact, there were some White House aides who gave Stephanopoulos the nickname of ABC News commentator as opposed to commentator, George Stephanopoulos. And so, yeah, there have definitely been feathers ruffled in the past about these memoirs that take place during administration.
And what about the question of national security or things that are classified being disclosed? Is that common?
Yeah, look, that's a different question. I mean, when you have a book like this, you're supposed to put it through the process and get the relevant security agencies to sign off on it. So when I wrote my book, Shall We Wake the President, that talks about disaster preparation a couple of years ago, I went through this security review, and you don't publish the book until you get that final clearance. And so I think that's a time-honored tradition, and I think that is an important part of the process, so that people don't advertently or inadvertently disclose classified information that shouldn't be out there.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that that's semi-common, that people have gone ahead and published without going through that process?
It's completely common to have this review. I think for the most part, once somebody goes through the review and through this process and you get the clearance, then you can publish the book without a problem. I can't really speak to exactly what happened in case there's been a lot of back and forth.
Mm-hmm. And so you worked in the George W. Bush White House, a Republican. There is no love lost right now between Trump and the Bush family. George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, it was a bit more, H.W., I believe, said that he did vote for Trump, but W., the son, has said that he will not vote for Trump. What's your sense? And obviously, I don't want to. We're not calling you a common traitor here, but what's your sense on what's driving that animosity between the W camp and the Trump camp?
Yeah, look, this often happens where you have presidents of the same party don't necessarily get along all the time. In the Clinton administration, they weren't the biggest fans of the Carter administration. In fact, there was a guy who was supposed to be deputy chief of staff in the Clinton administration who had served in the Carter administration, and he got kiboshed specifically because he worked in that previous and I think the Carter administration taint hurt this guy, Stu Eisenstadt. But I think having him on board would have helped because he knows the White House process. So sometimes I think the animosity between administrations doesn't necessarily help advance the interests. Obviously, between the Clinton and the Obama administrations, there was some tension because Hillary had indeed run against Obama. And so there's some tension there. On the other hand, Hillary served in the Obama administration as Secretary of State. So there are ways to overcome them also. Like I remember in the George H.W. Bush administration, there was some thought that the Reagan people would get to stay on. And in fact, they were all fired after Bush takes over from Reagan, and Bush had been Reagan's vice president. And one of the transition officials for Bush kind of dismissed the Reagan people by saying, our people don't have ideologies, they have mortgages.
Interesting. And your book also, as we touched on, talks about the rivalries or the tension between the JFK administration and the LBJ administration as well, obviously in the same party there too. In terms of, again, going flash forward to today and looking at it through the lens of the past, when we're looking at how Trump has run policy, how he's taken, at least people in the press say that he brings in family members, he brings in outsiders, he brings in folks from the business community, he's bringing people who aren't necessarily the quote-unquote swamp creatures. Do you agree with that assessment? How does he compare with his predecessors?
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton was calling people all the time to get advice and guidance. And sometimes the White House staff would be a little flummoxed by the advice that Clinton was getting from the outside that was shaping policy on the inside. And the story I tell in my book about this is Clinton, after losing the 1994 election and Republicans take over Congress for the first time in 40 years, Clinton starts getting advice from a secret person named Charlie, the code name of Charlie. It turns out that Charlie was Dick Morris, who is a kind of conservative leaning political consultant. He'd worked for Democrats, but he also was kind of migrating in a Republican direction at the time. And he was helping Clinton, remember, triangulate, which is he's not on the left, he's not on the right. He was trying to be above both parties. And he was getting that advice from Morris, which was alienating some of the liberal White House staff members. And so people said, well, we're used to Clinton getting these outside calls, but he seems to be getting this consistent message from this one guy, Charlie. We don't know who he is. And I thought that led to some tension. So outside advice is not necessarily a new thing in presidential politics.
Do you think that this question of triangulation with Trump, there was certainly the tension between Bannon and sort of the Jared Kushner wing, that there was some sense that Bannon was trying to really channel the base, and reportedly the nicknames that the Bannon camp had for the Kushner camp, calling them New York Democrats. Do you think there's truth to that rivalry, or again, is this an overblown characterization from the press?
Well, I do talk about that a little bit in Fight House, that there seem to be a couple of different ideological teams. But I think ideological splits are also not new to administrations. In the Reagan administration, you famously had the divide between the conservatives and moderates. In the Clinton administration, I already alluded to, you had the kind of liberal young White House staffers who had this tension with Dick Morris and his more conservative triangulating advice. So you often have these kinds of divides within administrations. And in fact, in Fight House, I talk about the three levers for controlling infighting. And one of them is ideological comedy, meaning people who are aligned ideologically are less likely to fight. Now, you also may not get best advice if you have people all from one perspective, but if you have more ideological alignment, there's going to be less fighting.
And I guess, as you mentioned, you wrote this book because you wanted to see how Trump compares to the past. What surprised you most about how Trump compares to the past?
I was really surprised to see that this stuff existed in every administration. I'm a presidential historian. I've served in the White House. I've written 3 previous books about the presidency. I knew there was some fighting in the White House. I did not realize, A, how much fighting was in every single White House, and B, how petty they could be in every single White House. And I researched the book with my jaw constantly dropping because there were so many great, delicious fights that really had awesome details, and I recount all of them in Fight House, and it was a hoot to write, and I think it'll be a hoot to read.
And one thing that Trump, his supporters certainly have said over and over is that they find Trump to be refreshingly authentic, that the question of him just saying it like it is, as opposed to kind of the traditional political machine doing a double speak. People would point to, for example, Clinton's private position for her Goldman Sachs speeches and then her public position, which was different. Do you think there's truth to that Trump is more upfront in terms of how he himself speaks and how he views things? And do you think that moves also to his White House in terms of people just being a bit more transparent? And after all, he was a reality TV star. And do you think that might be sort of feeding into why the press is painting him as so unprecedented?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the old famous joke about politics. Sincerity, if you can fake that, you can fake anything, right? I mean, people are looking for authenticity in their leaders. They want leaders who they believe are speaking honestly about who they are and what they believe. This is not about Washington Post fact checks per se, but more about do you really get a sense of who they are? And there's some politicians who just seem fake. They seem inauthentic. And I think that is something that counts against them. And that's why politicians try and present a certain face to the American people. The closer that face is to the actual face of the person, the more authentic that person is going to be, and that person is going to have more success running.
So how would you say Trump compares to his predecessors, his modern predecessors, on this question of authenticity?
I think Reagan was really good on the authenticity front. I think George H.W. Bush had some challenges on the authenticity front. So, for example, he famously talked about how he liked pork rinds when he was trying to connect to people. And everybody knew this is a guy who went to Yale, who grew up in the Northeast, who kind of had this this Eastern establishment air about him. And so the pork rinds thing didn't necessarily play. Now, his son, George W. Bush, really did grow up in West Texas. And throughout parts of his career, they did try to deride him as an Eastern establishment, Yale, Harvard-going person. And that worked against him sometimes, specifically in his 1978 race for Congress, which he lost in the primary. But after that, he said that he was really never going to be out-countryed again. And he made sure he had this authentic self with the leather jacket and the jeans and the cowboy boots and the cowboy hat. And he made sure that the American people understood that that was the real him and not the guy who'd gone to Yale and Harvard Business School.
Interesting. So letting our readers know or our viewers know, what's the biggest takeaway you want to take them to take away reading your book about what's happening right now with the Trump administration?
I think it's interesting to see that there's fighting in every White House, and I think your readers will want to compare and make their own judgments about how each administration compares to one another, and whether fighting is a good thing or a bad thing. Right? There are purposes to fighting, and sometimes in fighting can have a beneficial effect in terms of sorting out challenging questions that an administration is facing. In fact, the Johnson administration could have used a little more fighting on the Vietnam question. And in fact, Johnson tried to enforce groupthink, so much so that there were a couple of State Department aides who were skeptical of the Vietnam policy, but they were so afraid of Johnson finding out that they were skeptical that they formed a little group. They called it the non-group, and they met secretly so that Johnson would never know.
And that's an interesting point that you bring up in terms of this question of Trump, because on the one hand, you have people in the media and the Democratic Party who say that Trump is a dictator. He's very much a top-down, neo-Nazi. Yet you also have the media saying that his White House is incredibly tumultuous and there's all kinds of fighting and rivalries. Do you find there's some hypocrisy in terms of those very polar opposites characterizations?
Yeah, look, you find all kinds of accusations of presidents. I mean, the Republican presidents tend to be stupid, except when they're evil geniuses and Machiavellian. So I don't necessarily buy every media characterization of this president or any president. I think that these narratives shift all the time. And one of the things I'm trying to do in Fight House and as a historian in general is to take a look after the administration's over, after you have the archives open, after you have the oral histories, and see what the real story is of what the people actually did and what outside forces they were reacting to. Because in the White House, you're in a bubble. Sometimes you don't get all of the information that's going on out there. Sometimes you don't hear all the criticism, and sometimes you hear it too much and overreact to it. So it's fascinating to me as a historian, but also someone who's worked in the White House, to see after an administration's done how the outside world was impacting what was going on the inside in 1600 Pennsylvania.
All right. Tubby Troy, we're going to leave it right there. Our viewers, again, make sure you check out his book, Fight House, Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump. Thank you so much, Tubby, for joining us here at Just the News.
Thank you, Gary.